5 disturbing medieval chastity belts knights used on their wives. What would you do if you were a medieval knight? Riding off to war for months or even years, knowing your wife would be left behind surrounded by temptation? Could you trust her faithfulness, or would fear drive you to take desperate, even disturbing measures? In the darkest corners of medieval legend, men are said to have locked their wives in devices of iron and steel chastity belts for marching to the battlefield. These contraptions, cruel and unthinkable today, were believed to ensure fidelity by making infidelity physically impossible. The very thought of a woman being forced to live, eat, and sleep inside a locked cage of metal speaks to a chilling obsession with control, fear, and mistrust that defined much of the Middle Ages. But were these belts real instruments of marital control, or later inventions crafted to mock the anxieties of men? Whatever the truth, the stories endure haunting reminders of how power, love, and fear can twist into something terrifying. In this video, we uncover 5 disturbing medieval chastity belts knights were said to use on their wives, exploring the myths, the legends, and the unsettling reality behind one of history's most controversial objects. Chastity belt number 1. The Iron Belt of Florence. Among the most infamous legends of medieval chastity devices is the Iron Belt of Florence. This grim contraption, said to have been forged in Italy during the late Middle Ages, has long captured the imagination of historians and storytellers alike. Heavy, unyielding, and cruel in design, it was believed to be locked around a wife's body by a knight before he departed for war, ensuring her fidelity not through trust, but through steel. The iron belt was often described as a crude cage of iron plates, joined together with leather straps or rivets, and fitted with small openings to allow the most basic bodily functions. But these openings were tiny and jagged, making everyday life agonizing. The message was clear. The belt was not only a symbol of chastity, but also a prison of the body. Living with such a device would have meant constant pain, infections, and humiliation. Many scholars, however, argue that the so-called Iron Belt of Florence was never truly used in practice. Surviving examples in museums are often dated to the Renaissance or even the 19th century, suggesting they were created as warnings, curiosities, or even dark jokes about medieval fears. Yet the fact that people believed in them at all speaks volumes about the anxieties of the age. 2 knights consumed by dread of betrayal, the Iron Belt represented absolute control. To their wives, it represented captivity in the name of loyalty. Whether or not this device was widely real, its legend reveals a disturbing truth. Medieval marriage was as much about possession as it was about love. The Iron Belt of Florence remains a haunting symbolist story where fear triumphed over trust. The line between devotion and domination was locked in iron. Chastity belt number 2. The German Museum Chastity Belt. One of the most disturbing chastity belts ever displayed comes from Germany, where several examples were exhibited in museums during the 18th and 19th centuries. Known as the German Museum Chastity Belt, this device has horrified visitors for generations with its brutal design. Unlike the simpler iron belts of legend, these examples were often crafted with intricate locks, serrated edges, and, in some cases, inward-facing spikes meant to make even the thought of intimacy unthinkable. The design alone suggests torment. Imagine cold metal plates encircling the waist and groin, secured by a padlock that only the absent husband could unlock. Tiny perforations allowed for minimal hygiene, but they also increased the risk of infection. Some belts even featured cruel embellishments, sharp teeth or spikes that turned the device into a weapon against the woman forced to wear it. If authentic, such a belt would have transformed a wife's daily life into a nightmare of pain and constant fear. But here, myth and reality blur. Most historians believe the German museum pieces were never used in the Middle Ages, but rather created later, perhaps during the Renaissance, as moral warnings, or in the Victorian era as sensational curiosities. They reflected not so much medieval practice as enduring male anxiety over female sexuality. Still, their impact on the public imagination was immense. Tourists gazing upon these belts in German museums were left with a chilling impression of medieval cruelty and control. Whether real or symbolic, the message remained the same. Women's bodies were seen as property to be guarded, locked, and punished. The German museum chastity belt may not have been fastened onto thousands of wives, but its story has been fastened onto history itself. It endures as a disturbing reminder of the lengths to which fear and mistrust could drive those who wielded power. Chastity belt number 3, the locked heart belt of France, in the folklore of medieval France. One of the most infamous chastity devices was known as the locked heart belt. Unlike the crude iron cages of chastity belta mamesa of Italy or Germany, this belt was described in chronicles and poems as a symbol as much as a punishment. Its centerpiece was often said to be a heart-shaped plate of metal. Locked tightly around a woman's body as her husband rode off to war, the imagery was powerful and cruel. The heart, normally the symbol of love, was here transformed into a prison, bound with iron and sealed with a key. According to legend, knights would present the belt as a declaration of ownership, locking it around their wives and taking the only key with them on their crusades or campaigns. The woman left behind was expected to live with constant discomfort, her loyalty guaranteed not by affection, but by fear and restraint. As with so many chastity belt tales, historians caution that the locked heart belt may never have been a real device. Instead, it likely emerged as satire or moral allegory, mocking the insecurity of men who could not trust their wives. French satirical texts from the 15th and 16th centuries often depicted husbands as jealous fools, relying on absurd contraptions to enforce fidelity. Yet the persistence of the story reveals a deeper truth. The locked heart belt embodies the tension between love and control, between devotion and domination. Even if it was a literary invention, it reflected the very real fear of infidelity and the patriarchal desire to claim women's bodies as property. The locked heart belt of France may never have been worn in steel, but it was worn heavily in imagination, etched into cultural memory, as a chilling reminder of how far mistrust can twist the meaning of love. Chastity belt number 4. The punishment belt of England in England. The legend of chastity belts took on a darker form not only as supposed tools of jealous knights, but also as instruments of punishment. Known in folklore as the punishment belt, this device was said to be forced upon women accused of immorality, adultery, or simply behaving in ways deemed inappropriate by their communities. It was not the symbol of a husband's mistrust, but of society's judgment. The punishment belt was often described alongside other infamous tools of humiliation, such as the scoldess bridle, a metal cage placed over the head of quarrelsome or outspoken women. Together, these devices were designed not only to restrain the body but to break the spirit. In some tales, the belt featured spikes or sharp ridges, ensuring that even the smallest movement brought pain. Imagine the terror of being paraded through town, locked in iron as neighbors jeered and priests declared you a sinner. Historical evidence suggests that many of these belts displayed in England were created in later centuries, possibly during the Tudor or Victorian eras, as cautionary symbols rather than true medieval artifacts. But the myth of the punishment belt carried weight. It reinforced the idea that female sexuality and independence were threats that needed to be controlled, locked away, or publicly shamed. Even if no English woman ever wore such a device, the belief in its existence reveals the deep anxieties of the time. It shows how fear of women's autonomy could be weaponized into symbols of restraint and suffering. The punishment belt of England, whether real or imagined, stands as a haunting reminder of how cruelty can be cloaked in morality and how control was enforced, not just in private homes, but in the public square. Chastity belt number 5, the Victorian myth belt by the 19th century. The chastity belt had taken on a new life not as a medieval reality, but as a Victorian myth. During this era, museums, collectors, and moralists displayed chastity belts as supposed relics of the Middle Ages, fueling both fascination and horror. These belts, often finely crafted from polished steel and fitted with elaborate locks, were rarely tools of war or marriage. Instead, they were products of imagination, created to reinforce strict Victorian ideals about purity, sexuality, and control. In exhibitions across Europe, visitors gawked at these belts behind glass cases, shuddering at the thought of women forced to wear them. Some were even published in illustrated catalogs, complete with dramatic descriptions of knights locking away their wives before marching off to crusades. The myth was powerful because it fit the moral anxieties of the time, a society obsessed with chastity, terrified of female desire, and eager to believe in the cruelty of the Dark Ages. But historians today are nearly unanimous most of these Victorian chastity belts were fakes. They were crafted not in medieval forges, but in the workshops of the 18th and 19th centuries, often as curiosities or moral warnings. The real Middle Ages may have had many dark practices, but widespread use of chastity belts is more legend than fact. Still, the Victorian myth belt matters because it shows how powerful stories can be. By presenting chastity belts as authentic relics, Victorians shaped the way generations came to view the medieval past as a time of brutality, oppression, and grotesque control. Even now, the image of a knight locking his wife in iron endures, thanks less to history than to the myths of the 19th century. The Victorian myth belt closes our list not because it was worn, but because it reveals how legends can become more enduring than truth and how fear, desire, and morality can forge chains as lasting as any iron. From the Iron Belt of Florence to the German museum pieces from France's locked heart to England's punishment. Belt, and finally, to the Victorian myth belt, one truth becomes clear. The chastity belt is as much legend as it is history. Whether forged in iron or in imagination, these devices embody the same chilling theme sphere of betrayal, obsession with control, and the power struggles woven into marriage and society. Knights may not have locked their wives in iron cages as often as popular stories suggest, but the very belief in such practices tells us everything about the anxieties of the age. Men feared absence would bring infidelity, and societies feared women's independence. So, they created symbols, sometimes real, sometimes invented, that turned women's bodies into battlegrounds of loyalty, morality, and power. The chastity belt endures not because it was common, but because it represents something timeless, the dark side of human relationships, where love becomes ownership and devotion is twisted into domination. As we close this chapter, remember, history is not only about what truly happened, but also about the myths we choose to believe. And sometimes those myths are just as revealing as the facts themselves. If you found this exploration of medieval legends and dark desires fascinating, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Whispers Through Time. Join us as we uncover more shadows of the past, where history and myth collide in unforgettable ways.